Hello, everyone. Welcome to Trends You Cannot Ignore. This is the inaugural version of Trends You Cannot Ignore, and I think we're starting out with a home run. There are a lot of folks that can talk about trends. I don't think there's anybody that can talk about it in a way that is very duct tape. In other words, very practical. Like, what are we going to do now with things? This is Rohit Bhargava. He is the founder of the Non-Obvious Company. He's been an entrepreneur for many years. Started 3 successful companies. Written an entire series of books about non-obvious trends, kind of concluded that, at least he told me that was the end, with the non-obvious Megatrends, although I suspect it's in his blood and he'll never quit doing it. But we're going to talk about trends, but I think in a lot of ways we're going to talk about where we are now, what we need to do now. So Rohit, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm very excited. It's always fun to talk to you, and talking about trends is one of my favorite things.
So where did you and I first meet? I want to think it was about 10 years ago at a South by Southwest, probably at a bar. You probably bought me a drink because you're that kind of guy.
I am known for that sort of thing. Yeah, I am. But yeah, it was either that or maybe it was an event where we both happened to be there, and I'd known your content and I'd knew your book and all of that stuff. So you've done endorsements for me in the past, and I think we got connected through maybe some of that as well. So yeah,
and you've been a guest on the Duct Tape Marketing Podcast at least twice that I can remember. So we've certainly got that history as well, and that's why you were really one of the first people that came to mind for doing this. So I'll start off by asking, a lot of people, when you talk about trends, you think of these people that put themselves out as futurists. And I think that I've heard that word maybe even rubs you a little wrong. So let me ask you how you would describe what it is that you do.
Yeah, it's funny. I have these talks that I do usually on stage, but now virtually. And one of the slides in the talk says, "I am not a futurist." So I actually, there's a reason why I say that, because I think a lot of times when you hear about trends, you hear them in two different ways. One is someone's like, "Oh, let me write a sexy blog post about trends based on
like
a
every
couple of
November,
things."
every December, right?
Yeah, maybe it's November, December, or maybe it's just randomly in the middle of the year, and you're just like, "Yeah, let me talk about trends in marketing that I see since the pandemic." And so it's like a cute blog post.
Right.
And I say it in that way intentionally because the level of effort that goes into it is also very minimal, right? You find a couple of things, you stick them out there. Then the opposite side, which is what you're talking about, is the so-called futurists, who are people who do this professionally. They're usually European. They talk to governments about what the city of what the country of like Dubai is going to be like in 2050.
Yeah.
And they talk about the World's Fair and the World's Expo, and they're like on this super high level where it's the opposite of duct tape, right? It's like so far into that, think about that kind of stuff, but it's really hard to figure out what to do with it. And so when I got into this space as a marketer, right, because I spent more than 10 years working in marketing agencies, not as an entrepreneur, but as an agency guy. So that was my background before I became an entrepreneur 5 years ago. And I started writing about trends in a way that was practical. And what I did to do that was I said, look, I'm seeing all these different stories of things that are happening.
Yeah.
I'm elevating that to say, this is what a trend is. And my definition of that was what I would call a curated observation of the accelerating present. So that was my like super short definition. And I was basically observing like what's happening now and what's accelerating. And I wrote a trend report. And to be honest with you, the first time I did it in 2011, it was basically a cute blog post.
Yeah.
But that cute blog post went viral. It had 300,000 people that read it and shared it. And so at that point, I'm like, wow, people really like trends. I should do this. And it was at the end of the year. So then I did it again the following year, and I had just as many people, actually more people read it. And so then the third year I turned it into a blog post plus an ebook that I just launched on Amazon myself. The fourth year I did the same thing. Then it became like an Amazon bestseller, which is not that difficult for anybody who kind of knows how to work the system, but it felt significant at the time. So then the fifth year I turned it into a full-length book, and that's where Non-Obvious was really born. So that one hit the Wall Street Journal list. It was around the time when I left Ogilvy and started my own thing. So that was my journey into getting into trends. And then every year, like you said, I did a new version of the book up until this past January, where I did Non-Obvious Megatrends, which was the 10-year anniversary. And the last time I publicly kind of said, and it's still true, by the way, this is the last time I'm doing it as a full-length book. So,
Oh, I bet you've got some Post-it notes somewhere that you're following some things still.
I got a drawer full of them, my friend. They're all right here.
So it is funny because, you know, for a lot of people, trends are just, you know, you go out far enough that you suggest something that can't be proven, that nobody's going to track, you know, that you get to say, you know, maybe I had a couple wins, maybe I didn't have, but I agree. I think one of the things that you do is it's so practical. So, you know, trends, I mean, I've for many years written kind of, here's what I see coming in small business. Nowhere near to the extent of what you've invested in. It's just some of my observations. And it is always some of my best posts, or most read, most shared posts, because people do like them. I mean, trends are cool. I mean, people like to talk about them. A lot of times they take forever. You know, I remember we were talking about mobile marketing for 10 years before, you know, poof, one day it happened and it just became, you know, a practical reality. But there are a lot of people that talk about kind of future forward things. I would suggest that, you know, the disruption that we're going through right now has accelerated so many trends that maybe people 4 or 5 years ago said, yeah, you know, online grocery shopping is going to be a deal, you know, someday. And all of a sudden, you know, this disruption has really accelerated some of these trends that maybe you've spotted. So I wonder if you could talk for a minute about, you know, that dynamic.
Yeah, it's interesting the things that you raised, and maybe you even did it intentionally just to set me up. In which case, I appreciate that. But a lot of times when we think about trends, we think in terms of what you said, online shopping, for example,
Right.
or mobile marketing. And in my opinion, none of those are actually trends.
Yeah.
Those are just things that exist. So mobile marketing exists, social media exists, TikTok exists, and calling TikTok a trend is not really accurate. It's sort of like looking at a shelf of ingredients in your pantry, seeing flour, seeing sugar, seeing eggs, and saying, "Oh, you see that? That's a cake." I'm like, well, it could be a cake, like if you baked it and did something to it, but if you don't, it's just flour sitting on a shelf. And I think a lot of times what we see described as so-called trends is basically just flour. It's something sitting on a shelf and someone saying, oh, that's a trend, when actually it's just something that exists. So to flip it a little bit, the way I would think about a trend is by attaching a behavior to it. So
Right.
for example, if we were to say, you know, online grocery shopping, and look deeply at the growth of online grocery shopping, which probably is a shock to nobody that that's been growing, right, because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
What you might extrapolate from that is that people are desperate for convenience. And so what I might say is, look, there's a bigger trend happening here, which is desperate convenience. For example, I could, you know, brand that as a term. Then what I would do if I were researching this is I would go out and I would look for what are some other examples outside of online grocery shopping where people are desperate for convenience. And when you start to find other examples, that's where I think you add color and context to something that's a trend, because you bring it across multiple industries.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing, though, is that a lot of times that behavior, well, let's face it, that change, you know, needs an accelerant, because there are a lot of things that I think have been, you know, I think telemedicine. Why is telemedicine taking so long to really become a thing? Well, it needed that accelerant to make people change, didn't it?
Yeah, sometimes the accelerant is something that happens through no control of our own.
Right.
Sometimes it's an intentional accelerant, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think that the growth of virtual reality, for example, that was very intentional by the people who were making it. They were really trying to push
Yeah.
the idea that we could have this immersive virtual reality experience. And some people bought into it and got their headsets, and maybe some of the people on the call have one at home that's gathering dust. But there were these moments in time where people were really trying to push something. And yeah, that has limited success too, because you're right, like there wasn't the external factor making it urgent.
So one of the things that I think is interesting about your work, and maybe particularly your most recent, the Megatrends, you know, where you've kind of said, I mean, by virtue of giving it that name, these are the biggies. These are the things that have, you know, stood the test of time. These are the things getting bigger. And I was a little bit struck by the fact that I think there were 10. Is that right? You had 10 in the book?
10,
Right?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was struck by the fact that you could boil it down to people want people to be more human. I mean, is that an oversimplification?
A lot of them do focus on this idea of uh, the desire for more humanity
Yeah.
in business, in
Yeah.
relationships. Yeah, yeah, for sure. There are definitely themes across these, and look, the thing is with many of them that I have written about, and in fact, one of them was called Human Mode.
Yeah.
And it was around this idea that we appreciate and value the experiences that are more human. And increasingly, as we get more automation in the world, the more human something is, the more it will feel premium, and
Mm.
therefore be worth paying more for, or giving more respect to. And so that one mega trend was very specifically about this. But you're right, there is this kind of underlying theme of humanity, and I think it's because all of these trends that I'm writing about and that I'm researching are based on human behavior. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
focus of all of them. It's why do we act in the ways we do? Why do we make the choices that we make? And then the layer on top of it to make it useful is, if we understand that, it's almost like behavioral psychology applied to marketing, which is, if we understand that, what can we do from a marketing and storytelling point of view to influence people, persuade them?
Well, and I think the interesting thing about that is so many people have focused on the technology part, and you actually even have one of your trends being about being more analog, is being more human. I mean, I got so many pitches from people wanting to be on my podcast, what to do, how to market during a pandemic, and it all came down to being more human. I mean, stop spamming people, was essentially it. And so, would you say that while that has never gone out of style, would you say that there is a refocus on it, as people desire that behavior?
Um, I think that there is some refocus on it based on this other big principle that affects everything that we do and everything we see, which is trust.
Yeah,
And if you
believability.
think about trust in the context of, especially now when we're kind of finished with one political convention and in the middle of another one, here in the US at least,
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, it's a big question. Who do you trust? Why do you trust them? How do you give trust? How do you know if someone's trustworthy? And these are the sorts of questions that to some degree they underlie some of these trends. Do we want more humanity because we trust people more than we trust organizations? Everyone I mean, that's not new, right? You've probably heard that or know that or read that before. The other element of trust and the trend that you're talking about is one that I called revivalism. And it was about how we're turning back the clock in many situations. We're remaking old movies that we love. We're making puzzles again. We're listening to music on vinyl. We are having these retro experiences. And to some degree, it's because we romantically remember. There you go. See, you got the vinyl right there. Because we romantically remember those things from our past and we trust them. And in a world where you don't know what to trust now, you turn back the clock and remember the good old days. And that's what that trend was kind of about.
Yeah, since you mentioned the political conventions, I'll use one as an example. I was struck by how many times watching the Democratic convention the word empathy was used, hundreds of times. Through what I saw. Now, some of that may be just trying to create contrast, but I think also there certainly is. It feels more like right now there's a huge desire for that, almost to the level of a trend.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we always appreciate empathy when we see it, and we hate when we don't experience it on every level, whether it's like a macro level of having a president who often usually lacks it, through to a customer service experience where
Yeah.
like somebody is dealing with you and you're on the phone and they don't empathize at all, and it's frustrating. So that's superhuman, I think, that we seek that out and that we want that. um, I don't know that people necessarily describe it in that way. Sometimes they use a lot of different language for it. This
Yeah.
person just gets it or they
Yeah.
don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get to the super practical aspect. I've been telling a lot of marketers that, our job right now is to just, our job is always to solve problems. I mean, what problems do our ideal customers have? How can we communicate that we solve that problem? A whole lot of new problems have been created. So for a lot of people in a lot of industries, a lot of lifestyles. What are a handful of things that if you were talking to small business marketers, which by the way you are, you might tell them that here are things you could do, should do, might do.
Yeah. There's a couple. I mean, one that I would focus on is around a trend that that I wrote about and called instant knowledge.
Yeah.
And it was based on this idea that we increasingly expect to be able to learn anything faster. And because we expect to learn anything faster, we are hungry and have become connoisseurs of seeking out the information that we need. And so in marketing lingo, we tend to call the servicing of that need content marketing,
Yep.
right? We create useful stuff. We hope that people find it and therefore they find us. And I think that I would argue that now more than ever, that has become more important for everyone, even if you're not selling a so-called expertise or a service.
Yeah.
Because when you deliver that and bring people into that experience and then introduce them to, even if it's a product, people are willing to give their time and attention to that. And I think that I just see so many examples of why that's more and more important now. And most companies, as everybody on this call knows, are not that good at it. They need help.
Would you suggest, however, though, that one of the dynamics I see going on is content has gone down to almost zero value in some ways, because not only because there's so much of it, it's because of what you just said. We expect to be able to find the answer, the information about anything. So how do we actually make it more valuable, so that people get an outcome because of it, not just the answer. We don't need to store more information. We know how to find information. So how do we focus on outcomes through that content as opposed to just more information?
Well, I think that I don't see there having been any sort of a decrease in importance of content. I think that there has certainly been a increase in frustration of sifting through stuff that sucks
Yeah.
to find what we actually want.
Right.
And the challenge is, and you know this with books as well as I do, like when anybody can publish a book, the fact is lots of people who publish books really shouldn't. They can't write. They suck at marketing. They suck at talking about whatever the thing is that they wanted to talk about. And their work is totally useless and takes up space. And I'm not the dictator of books that could tell somebody whether their idea is valuable or not, but there's a lot of crap out there.
Yeah.
And I think that what that means is there's more opportunity for us to not only be the creators. And I think that a lot of times when people think content marketing, they immediately think creation. I need to create content marketing. A underappreciated form of content marketing is going out and figuring out what the best stuff is that already exists and curating it for someone. So for example, one of the things we're doing with my publishing company, so we've got a team of writers that are going out and saying, okay, everybody who writes a book wants to know, how do I get more reviews? Reviews on Amazon, reviews somewhere else. There are probably 25 great blog posts written by authors, publishers, all sorts of other people out there. And there's probably 85 idiotic blogs. Find 5 great blog posts, put them all in one article and say, this is what you need to read. That would be really, really valuable.
Yeah.
And that is something that is content marketing, but it's not you creating it. It's you just going out and finding what is the most useful stuff, right?
Yeah, and as consultants, I mean, that's obviously something they could apply to every one of their small businesses that they work with as well, as a way to create content in a much faster, version. I lost you there for a second. So let's. I'm going to open up for questions. So you guys, when I do open up for questions, please, you can unmute your video, unmute your mics. But let's let Rohit take one more question from me. How would you advise small business marketing consultants who are on this call today, who might be listening to this at a later date, to get better at curating and recognizing some of these non-obvious trends themselves?
I think there's a couple things you could do. The most important is to recognize your bias and what you typically pay attention to, and try and get outside of that.
Yeah. And
to some degree, it's read stuff you don't agree with, watch the other political convention, whichever one you don't agree with.
Right.
And to to another degree, it's read or pay attention to stuff that is created for people who aren't like you.
Yep.
And you know this, John, one of my favorite methods to do that is that I buy magazines and I read magazines that are not targeted at me.
Yeah.
So I'll read Teen Vogue magazine, which is for 16-year-old girls. I'll read like a magazine about knives and hunting, and I don't really own any knives besides kitchen knives, and I don't go hunting. But like every time I do that and I pick up one of those, I get to see the ads that are written for someone else. I see the language. I see celebrities I've never heard of. I see articles on topics that are just unfamiliar to me. And the more I challenge myself to do that, the more I build the muscle of something we talked about earlier, which is empathy.
Yeah.
And the literal definition, or at least one of them that many people use, is the ability to put yourself in someone else's life, in someone else's shoes.
Yeah.
And reading what they read and paying attention to what they pay attention to is a great way to do that.
Yeah, I personally have used that quite often. Every book I've written, I go out and I find some other books that are not related to it, but I go in with the mindset of, I'm writing this book about this. What is this? How does this relate to that topic? And I always get some good ideas. So before we open up for questions, and again, I invite you to unmute your video, unmute your mics now, if ask Rohit a question. But one of the things I also want to ask you to do is, I mean, Rohit is generously given of his time to be here and share his knowledge and his expertise. So one thing that I think, I think books are the greatest, easiest, cheapest education that you'll ever get. For $18 to $14 to $18 to $20, you can get a lot, somebody's life's work. So I would ask you to please do me a favor, honor Rohit's presence here by going and buying Megatrends, the non-obvious. Give me the full title, Rohit. I'm butchering.
Yeah, it's non-obvious Megatrends.
There we go.
That is what the cover looks like.
Yep.
So yeah,